Right, good afternoon everyone. Firstly, thanks so much for coming along, and it's a real pleasure to be here on behalf of the Royal Photographic Society to give you a brief introduction to the world of drones and drone aerial photography. I was quite surprised how many stands there are here today selling drones. You know, there are these indoor flying arenas, stands full of the things, so I'm hoping that I haven't made my presentation too general, too simplified. So in this talk I'll be introducing firstly myself, how I got into the arena of aerial photography using drones, and then talk about some of the important things like legislations, licensing, insurance and so on, because in the next couple of years we're going to be seeing these things everywhere, and as a professional photographer myself, I'm just keen to make sure that anyone getting into the market goes through all the right procedures of getting insurance and licenses, because otherwise these platforms, as simple and safe as they look, or GPS stabilized, they can go wrong, and you just have to operate them in the right way to be safe. So I've been very fortunate to be involved in drones for the last 7 or 8 years. I actually started on this journey, if you like, from the modelling aspect. So 98 I started flying model aircraft, and I slowly got into fitting cameras to it, and then I saw these multi-rotor model helicopters that you see everywhere now developing on forums on the internet. So they evolved from people's garden sheds, which is fantastic, and then a couple of big manufacturers started churning them out in the Far East, and now they're everywhere. So with no further ado, let's start with who I am. My name's David Hogg. I'm jumping ahead of myself. This is what I'll be covering in the talk. So who am I? What is a drone? How did they evolve? What can they do? What is the state of the art? Can anyone buy one? What are the regulations? Can anyone use them commercially? And what to look for when hiring an aerial photographer? And that's all in the next 40 minutes. Fingers crossed. So who am I? My name's David Hogg. I'm the director of my own company called Horizon Imaging, and I'm based in Surrey and Hampshire. I say that because I'm actually moving house tomorrow into Hampshire, so I'm sort of straddling 2 counties at the moment. My company, Horizon Imaging, I set up to offer initially drone photography, but I also have a telescopic mast, 50-foot, fully portable, and I do architectural photography and virtual tours and video production. So I offer a whole package which is particularly suited for clients like estate agents, construction companies, anyone needing new and unique marketing photography for their clients or for their projects. As I mentioned earlier, I started in the realm of model flying back in 1998 and progressed through, this is just a fun park flyer, progressed through to building my own platforms specifically for taking aerial photographs. So this is a 1.5 meter electric model glider, and you'll just see in the bottom there's a tiny aperture where a tiny Casio 7 megapixel camera sat, and then via a video link to a screen on the ground I could see exactly what the camera was seeing in real time, and then I knew when to trick the shutter to take a photo. And that was around 2006, and that's when I took this photo of my school, Claremont Fancourt School in Esher in Surrey, and taking that shot, which I tend to think is my first decent aerial photo, really sparked the potential in my mind of doing this on a commercial basis, because this is a fantastic grade 2 or grade 1 listed building that no one has seen from that angle before, and the school is using that image to this day, you know, what is it, 8 years later, for marketing, because it's such a unique angle on a very traditional and well-known building. And it was around 2 years ago, 2013, that I decided it was now or never if I wanted to make a full-time business of this. And so I've now been full-time since April last year, so I'm just coming up to my first anniversary, if you like, and I'm pleased to say it's all going very well so far. So that's enough about me. What is a drone? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary says it's to make a continuous low humming sound. But I imagine that's not why you're here today, to listen to a talk about it. In effect, it's any pilotless, remotely controlled aircraft. This is probably what most people think of when you mention the word drone. This is a General Atomics Predator with a nasty missile mounted under it. And that's immediately giving people negative connotations of what a drone is. But it's interesting actually where the word drone comes from, and I'll just briefly talk about that. The word drone it was originally used to is still used to describe a type of bee. This is the drone here. It's a male bee, and its sole purpose is to mate with the queen when she's receptive, and then it dies. So it has this one purpose. It doesn't collect any honey. It doesn't do anything other than mate and then die. And a parallel can be drawn with the original use of the word drone, which started in the First and Second World Wars. They were radio-controlled pilotless aircraft that were either just flying bombs, like this one, or they were used for target practice. So the idea of something having a single purpose and then it was destroyed, either by blowing itself up or by being shot at, that's sort of how the word drone came into use. But since then, because of its use in the military theatre, it's now become synonymous with military use. This is a graph showing the popularity of the word drone in Google searches from 2005 to 2015. And you can see it's a very obvious increasing trend. Most of these peaks here are for military-related incidents, so a drone killing people or being shot down. But this item in red is the interesting one. This was when Amazon first started murmuring about using drones for delivering things back in about 2014, I think. And so, even though they're made out to be evil and bad things, if you see past the military applications, I believe there's so many novel and interesting and beneficial applications of the technology that really they're an incredible force for good. And for the purposes of this talk, I mean this if I mention the word drone. So it's an unmanned model helicopter with a camera attached to it, basically. So what can they do? Well, where do I start? Obviously everything is aerial based. So aerial photography, that's how I got into it. This is an aerial photo of St Martha on the Hill Church in Surrey, near where I live. And as you can imagine, the applications for getting an aerial perspective on anything is quite incredible. That's what really got me hooked on the whole technology in the first place. Moving on from that, filming, that's another incredibly rapidly growing industry. You might recognise this as a still from the Harry Potter film, Chamber of Secrets from 2002. Whilst the car was computer generated, this shot tracking this steam train flying in and around this viaduct was actually taken with a drone. Back then, 12 years ago, 13 years ago, it was actually a conventional model helicopter, so with a big main rotor disc on top, little one at the back, and to carry a cinema quality camera, it was probably about this big and was powered by a miniature gas turbine, because that's the only thing that could provide enough power for enough time to be of any use. Nowadays it's all electric and brushless motors. Another application, inspection. This is a shot I took for a construction company based down in Surrey. This is an early 20th century old school building, and they're converting it into a care home, and they wanted to inspect the entire surface area of the roof for damage so that they knew whether the roof needed repair or modification before they finished their project. And this would have taken days, or at least many hours, to set up either scaffolding or a cherry picker to get these sort of views of the entire surface area of the roof. I came there with my little fold-up drone in a box and did the entire roof in about an hour, and then just sent them a set of high-res photos which they could zoom into, and they got all the information they needed that way. Another application is mapping. This isn't something that I've done, but basically if you attach a particular type of sensor, be it normal imaging camera like a digital camera, or thermal imaging or radar, any type of sensor, onto a drone, you can then program the drone to fly a search pattern of zigzagging back and forth over a certain area, all controlled by GPS, and then you get an image like this. So either you can effectively take a single photo of a large plot of land, but without having to fly miles up in the air to get everything in one shot, or if you were using, say, a radar sensor, this can then be manipulated and moved around as a 3D model. And this has incredible applications for anything from open pit mining, so you can send a drone over a mine and you can see down to centimetres how the relief of the land has changed. So if you do that once every month, once every year, you can then see how the volume of the open pit mine has changed. That's just one application. Surveillance is probably a more contentious issue. That's probably how people first heard of drones in the news, likes of the police and emergency services using them for very sensible applications. So providing an eye in the sky over emergency accident areas, crime hotspots, or large gatherings of people. And then to the perhaps slightly less plausible ideas like Amazon delivering packages with drones. I think it'll be a few years before we see drones routinely delivering packages to people. But it takes people to try these wacky ideas for them to become standard everyday occurrences. There are two interesting applications of delivery related, which I think have a lot of scope. This is a project, I think it's in the Netherlands, for delivering a defibrillator very, very quickly to someone in the middle of a built-up area. It might take an ambulance 10, 15 minutes to get through traffic and deliver this vital piece of equipment, whereas a drone could be there theoretically in just a couple of minutes. And this particular one actually has a camera on the front, and it lands and gives you the defibrillator. It also delivers a tablet which connects you via a video feed to a doctor or a paramedic, and then they instruct you on how to use it. It's an incredible idea. It just needed someone to think of it. And similarly, just the other day I heard of a project going on in Papua New Guinea where this drone is being used to take blood samples from the middle of the bush, the desert, and fly it to a remote inspection base. And the problem is, to get there by car might take 4 hours over very bumpy, muddy terrain. The car might get stuck. This, with GPS, it can fly from the medical centre straight to the hotspot. They just load it up, press a button, and it flies back by itself. So the positive uses of drones are just fantastic, and I think they really need to be pushed and emphasised, and people need to realise that this technology has incredibly positive applications. I have to show you this one. This is a cartoon about Santa being kicked off his job by an Amazon delivery drone. I thought that was rather amusing. But basically, just about anything that needs to be either photographed from the air, carried in the air, obviously within reason, can be done with drone technology. So, focusing a bit more on photography, what is the state of the art? You've probably all seen something like this these days. If you hadn't seen it before you'd come to the show, you probably have now. I walked past, must be 5 or 6 stands of people selling things like this. As I mentioned, I came into this industry from the modelling side of things. Initially they were normal radio-controlled helicopters, big rotor disc on top, but slowly they've evolved into these because they're so much simpler mechanically. You've literally got a number of motors. It might be 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and they're brushless motors. There's one moving part. They're very, very reliable, and as I put here, good redundancy. If you've got more than 6 propellers, you can have a motor failure and it can still fly, whereas with a traditional model helicopter, if the main motor fails, you're going to come down. Highly scalable. The concept and the electronics and the brains that make these things fly can be as small as fitting on the palm of your hand to being the size of this stand, lifting 20 kilograms. It is really incredible just how scalable it is. So if you've got a big payload, you just need bigger motors, bigger propellers, bigger batteries, and vice versa going the other direction. And highly automated, as I mentioned, with the aerial mapping application. You can program these things via GPS to fly a series of waypoints over an area of interest and to do whatever you want, taking multiple images to composite into a mosaic or whatever. The other thing that in my mind has been just as revolutionary as the drone technology itself are 3-axis stabilized gimbals, and I've seen quite a number of those here today. This basically means that you can have a camera that's completely isolated from the platform it's attached to. And again, it uses exactly the same technology as the multi-rotor vehicles it's attached to. So 3-axis, so you've got 1, 2, 3 brushless motors, and on the camera tray itself, you'll have a tiny little inertial sensor, a bit like the thing you have in your phone that tells you whether it's upright or not. And the sensor gives feedback to the processing board, and then that gives control signals back to the motors. And basically, if you've seen anyone using or holding one of these platforms, the platform can be doing this, and the camera stays perfectly motionless. And really, until that technology evolved, aerial filming, aerial photography was really difficult and challenging, because you just had standard grade hobby servos which are relatively slow and inaccurate, so you always had some jitter or movement in the image. Whereas with these things, if they're properly set up and tuned, isolated from the platform above with vibration dampers, you get rock steady footage. And I still can't believe how steady the footage can be. Often you'll see video where you can see the legs of the multi-rotor in the shot, and the legs can be doing this, and the footage is bang level. The horizon doesn't move at all. It's just incredible, and that's why there's been such an explosion in popularity. One other thing, companies that developed these 3-axis gimbals then suddenly thought, what happens if we put some handles on it? And that has revolutionized the cinematography industry. There's a company called Free Fly Systems based in the US. They released one called the Movi, or Movi, M-O-V-I, and it is literally a 3-axis brushless gimbal, exactly the same as the one I just showed you, with handles on it, and it basically gives you the flexibility and stability of a Steadicam rig without the back-breaking weight. Obviously, the Steadicam rig holds the camera for you, and this you have to hold it physically with your hands, but the sort of moves you can get with a rig like this, you can be running down a street chasing someone, and I've seen examples where they've then passed the whole rig through the window into a taxi, and so you can get these incredibly seamless shots from, taken by several different cameramen in one move, and I just find it amazing myself. So, can anyone buy one? Yes. There is no reason, there's nothing to stop anyone buying their own drone, as long as it's not one of the military ones I showed you earlier. They are now available pretty much everywhere. High street stores like Maplin, Amazon, Hamleys, and then there are an infinite number of specialist online retailers just selling the drones. The thing that's made this possible is that these modern platforms are so stable and GPS equipped and everything that you don't need any prior experience to be able to fly them. My background, as I say, coming from model flying, I had to learn how to fly at a model flying club, where you get tuition from other members, other experts, and you can either go to a model flying club to learn to fly, or you spend a lot of money on spare parts and repairing things because you will crash. Model aircraft back in that day were very difficult to fly. There was no artificial stabilisation on them at all. But nowadays, because they're so self-stabilising, you can literally push the stick up and it'll hover there with GPS. It's got all these inertial sensors on board that means it won't drift around, and they've even got automatic landing switches on them. So if you're far away, you lose orientation, you just say return to home, it comes back and lands itself. And that's why they've become so popular. And that's why they're advertised as being able to be flown by anyone without any prior experience. However, and that's a big however, this whole process of going to a flying club, learning from experts, learning how to maintain your model, how to fly it safely, where you're allowed to fly it, where you're not allowed to fly it, that was actually quite crucial in making the whole model flying industry as safe as it was. So these days, if you don't need to do that, you don't get any tuition, you don't get any instruction on how to fly safely, although that is starting to change. Manufacturers are supplying proper guidelines now. But that's why we've seen things in the news about drones being flown too close to airports, over Buckingham Palace. I think there was a thing on the news recently, some guy's been, he's been caught 17 times flying his little drone over Buckingham Palace, over places where he shouldn't be flying them. And that's all because they're so easy to fly. And that is becoming a big problem. For those people that want to learn how to fly and go through the proper routes, as it were, I highly recommend joining the British Model Flying Association. For £30 a year or so, you can become a member. You get £2 million public liability insurance, which is what many people don't have, that just buy a drone from Macklin or whatever. And it comes with a manual of how to fly a model aircraft safely. And then they can hook you up with your nearest local flying club. And it's a fantastic opportunity to meet other people, get tips and learn how to fly and how to be a safe pilot. At the end of the day, the best thing, or the thing you have to do, is adhere to the CAA's regulations. And that's what, until recently, people that bought these things off the internet, they didn't know that these regulations existed, so they didn't know that they were breaking them by flying them over roads, over Buckingham Palace, although I would have hoped common sense would tell you not to do that. So the regulations are broadly outlined in a document from the UK Civil Aviation Authority called CAP 393 Air Navigation, the Order and Regulations, which is a pretty dry-sounding title. But this document is enormous, and it has to be enormous because it covers every type of flying object from the smallest drone up to full-size airliners. And there are a couple of specific articles in this set of guidelines that deal with unmanned aerial systems, as they're called. This first one is actually very generic. It says a person must not recklessly or negligently cause or permit an aircraft to endanger any person or property, which is relatively straightforward, you would hope. And there's also an accompanying one, not to allow or not to cause any danger to someone in an aircraft or danger to an aircraft itself. It would seem common sense, but people perhaps aren't aware that these things have a very long range. They can fly beyond, several thousand feet up into the path of oncoming airliners, and people need to become aware of the dangers of these things if they're used inappropriately. In themselves, they're not dangerous. It's just if they're used inappropriately, they're flown in the wrong places, then they can become a danger. 166 talks about very general rules about not flying more than 400 feet above the ground, making sure that the platform is safe before flying, and keeping it within the line of sight of the pilot, as I think it's 500 meters at all times. And then there's one more, which applies only to drones which have cameras attached to them, and this is the nitty-gritty of the proximity regulation. So you have to stay 150 meters from congested areas, so that's broadly defined as roads, buildings, areas where you'd have to have permission to fly, like over private land, and keeping 50 meters from people, vessels, vehicles and structures not under your control. So that means, yes, you can fly if you like in a public park, but you have to be careful. You have to make sure that anyone wandering around or wandering near you flying is aware of what you're doing, and you don't fly over them or near them. Again, it's relatively common sense stuff, but because people don't know about these regulations, they don't know if they're breaking them. The CAA have made a much simpler version of this, which is in a leaflet that they have on their website, and it's pretty straightforward. I'll just read the bold text here. So you're responsible for each flight. Before each flight, check the drone for damage. Keep the drone within line of sight at all times. You're responsible for avoiding collisions. Keep your distance from congested areas. Keep your distance from people, vehicles and buildings. Consider rights of privacy. So there's this whole media hoo-ha about people flying these things and spying on their neighbours, and newspapers using celebrities. You have to think about that. Because these cameras can give you views that you just can't get from the ground, you have to be aware of that you might be able to look into other people's property, and just put yourself in their position. You wouldn't like to be spied on by someone flying their thing near you, so don't do it the other way around. The last thing here is permission to use drones for paid work. So that's another big area that most people aren't aware of, that to do commercial work using a drone, you have to have a thing called a permission for aerial work from the Civil Aviation Authority. Or any type of work for valuable consideration, basically, if you get paid for it. And the permission looks a bit like this. It's not very exciting, but basically to apply for a permission, you have to give the CAA evidence of your pilot competence, I suppose. And to do that, there are a number of companies set up around the country who give you training, basically. It's a couple of days ground school. You go there, they teach you all about rules of the air, sharing airspace with other air users like full-size aircraft, and at the end of it you get a certificate, but you also have to do a flying exam so that they can see that you can actually fly the model safely. You can fly it in all sort of orientations, all altitudes, all angles, and you know what happens if there's a fail-safe situation. So if a motor was to cut out, what would you do, that sort of thing. As well as that, you need an operations manual, so you basically list all the equipment you're using, you list your method statements, how you go about your work, your ground routine, risk assessments, and how you keep flight logs. So it's a lot more rigid, but as I compare it to having a driving license, you wouldn't want the roads full of people driving these potentially dangerous things without getting a driving license, without insurance. It's just the same with drones. And as I put there, also make sure you have adequate insurance. And all these things, yes, they take time and they take a bit of money and investment, but I think if the market is going to survive in the UK, I think that might be my microphone. If the drone aerial photography market is going to boom, and really, boom is probably the wrong word, expand and be really successful, people have to abide by the regulations. Otherwise, some of you might be aware in the US they just put a blanket ban on all kinds of drone activity, commercial drone activity, and they're only just now starting to find a way to regulate it. France and Spain also have blanket bans on this type of operation, and we're very lucky in the UK that the Civil Aviation Authority are so forward-thinking, pragmatic in their approach to regulating this, that we're allowed to do it at all. So we just need to make sure that everyone that starts this off and gets started in this industry on a commercial basis does it properly. And at the end of the day, if you don't have a permission, it is actually illegal to do paid work, and you can be prosecuted by the CAA, which is not nice. There's a recently founded organisation called RPAS UK, the Association of Remotely Piloted Aircraft Systems, and it's a fantastic group of professional operators such as myself, and they have a forum on the internet where you can discuss any questions you have. And I've only been a member a few months, but I've learned so much from them. And if you've got any questions about how to get started using drones commercially, either look them up on the internet. I think their website is rpas.uk, or feel free to take one of my cards at the end and ask any questions you might have. Lastly, I'll just talk about, if you don't want to get into taking photos yourself, if you want to hire a company to do the work for you, it's one thing to own the equipment, but it's quite another to actually run a business and gain a good reputation. It made me smirk and maybe a bit annoyed once when I spoke to a golf course and they said, I was advertising my services, and they said, oh no, we've just bought a drone, so we're fine. Okay, fine. So, as I say, it's one thing to own the equipment, it's another thing to know how to use it. It's the same with any type of photography. So, I would recommend that you look for companies which firstly are licensed and insured, like I mentioned, and the thing to ask for is just, do you have a permission from the CAA? And if they can't present it, chances are they probably don't have one. And often it'll be the people that say, I can take an aerial photograph of you or your house for 20 quid. Getting all the licenses and insurances costs quite a bit of money. It's in several thousands of pounds. And so likelihood is if someone is offering to do commercial work for you for a very, very small amount of money, then they're probably not commercially registered, and it's probably best to stay away from them. Because at the end of the day, if they're not insured and they have an accident, they fly their thing into something, into a car, into a person, and they're not insured, then it's horrible. So use professional cameras. There are a lot of readily available, easy to fly things that accept GoPro cameras. Whilst I'm not dissing the GoPro camera, it's fantastic quality for its size. I see too many estate agents and companies that have obviously paid someone to sell their multi-million-pound house with a a horribly distorted fisheye photo taken in overcast weather with horribly flat colours. And I just think you've got to go that extra mile. You've got to use professional equipment if you want to offer a professional service. And likewise with post-processing. That's an art in itself, as I'm sure you're all aware as photographers. Too many times I see unprocessed photos on clients' websites, and I just think it's not that difficult to boost the colours, boost the brightness, and it makes such a difference to the final product. Again, if you have a background in traditional photography, you're likely to be able to take better aerial photos. It's quite simple. So everything from the composition to the type of lighting, I mentioned light here, it makes all the difference. And to have that background compared to someone that's just gone into Maplin and bought a Phantom, these are the things that call some of them, you get what you pay for at the end of the day. I've actually finished my talk a bit quicker than I had thought, but in conclusion, I think it's safe to say drones are here to stay. They're an extraordinary force for good, as I've mentioned, all the applications that they can be used for, diverse range of applications, and provided the operators know what they're doing, they understand the regulations and the technology and how to use it, they're very safe. There's no problem about using them. And I think it's safe to say that we've only scratched the surface of what's possible with the technology. And I hope this has given you a little insight into the world of drones. And if you have any questions, I think we've got about 10 minutes if anyone wants to come up and ask. Thank you very much for listening. I don't know if we have a roving, we do have a roving mic if anyone has any specific questions. I think there's one at the front. What type of aircraft do I use? Because I came into this from model flying, I've actually built my own platforms myself. So I think there's a picture, is this going to work? Earlier in the presentation, this is the platform I use. It's a 6-rotor drone, and I built it to be fully collapsible. Just get the picture up. So this one's actually fully collapsible. The arms fold flat, the legs fold up, and it fits into a box about this big. And I had to do that because I've got a smart car, and it wouldn't fit in the car any other way. So that's my main platform that I use at the moment. There's the next one that I'm currently building is an off-the-shelf one, because I built this when I was still working as an engineer, and I had evenings and weekends to dabble and tinker and spend months building it. But now running my own business, I just don't have the time anymore. So this is the one I'm working on at the moment. It's called a carbon core Cortex. It's got 8 motors, in 4 pairs, and that can lift a much heavier camera, a 3-axis gimbal, as I mentioned.
Is it likely for one person to fly the device and take and compose the pictures at the same time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'll just repeat it for those that didn't hear. Is it practical to do it as a one-person operation with the same person flying as taking the photographs? That is how I operate. What I do mainly is aerial still photography. So I'm doing the flying. I've got a screen on the ground where I can see exactly what the camera is seeing. I've actually got a monocle that sits under my eye, a bit like Terminator, and I can see in there what the camera is seeing. And so I'm looking over the monocle at the helicopter most of the time, and then I just glance down to make changes to the composition of the pictures. And it works very well. A lot of people work like that. The tricky thing is when you start to do aerial video, you do need to have 2 people. You have the pilot who will effectively put the camera in the right point in the sky, and then you'll have a camera operator that has a similar control system for moving the 3-axis gimbal around. And I've done work with companies, so I've been the pilot for another company whilst a camera op moves the camera, and it's a very flexible and powerful combination, and you just can't do that with one person. So it depends what you want to do.
Thanks, David. Very good. chargeable rates at the moment? What's happening in the industry with regards to how much you can charge for by the hour, by the project? How does it work currently?
Yeah, it's a question about what can you charge for it. It really depends on the size of your business. I mean, I'm just a one-man business, I've got very low overhead, so my typical rate for a job, you know, including travel and post-processing, is around the £350 to £400 mark, and most people seem very happy with that. If you've got several people in your company, you've got big premises, then anything up to £700 or £800 just for a still photo shoot is quite standard. Typical rates for video work, because you'll have to have two people on site, a camera op and a pilot, tend to be around 1,000 to 1,500 a day. It really varies on the application, on the complexity of the shoot, how long it will be, how long is a piece of string, I guess. But yeah, it's something I mentioned earlier. I don't just do drone photography. I think given the weather in this country, it's unwise to rely solely on an aerial type of photography. So the work, as I say, I've just come up to the first year of business. I would say maybe 25–30% has been aerial work. The rest has been either architectural photography or photography with a telescopic mast in areas where I can't use the helicopter. So I wouldn't solely rely on drones for your income, but it makes a fantastic add-on that makes you a lot more of a unique company, because you can do drones whilst other people can't. Yes. Yeah. The question was, if you do a lot of work in built-up areas, how do you use drones and stay within the regulations? It is difficult. There's no way around that. So I'm quite fortunate that a lot of the work I've done with drones has been big projects in the countryside, big multi-million-pound houses, that sort of thing, where there's no problem with the 50-metre limit. There are job requests I get which I just have to say no, I can't do that because it's not within, the regulations don't allow it. What I will say is that there is a different type of permission for aerial work called the CAOSC, Congested Area Operation Safety Case. I don't remember that. And that is a much more involved application process with the CAA. It's very new, it only came out last month, February. Just last month, and you have to go into a lot more detail about the way you operate, and you have to have your aircraft checked for airworthiness. That's part of the problem, is that all these things are generally built with hobby grade equipment, and you've got no idea what their mean time before failure is and that sort of thing. The end result is that you can then, if you have one of these kiosk things, you can then generally fly closer to built up areas because your platform has been vetted and inspected, and it's known to be much safer than your hobby model. So I think that can reduce the 50 metres down to 10 or 20. But it does a lot of effort, but if you do a lot of work in built-up areas, then it's worth doing. But generally, yes, that's why I have the mast for jobs in built-up areas that I just can't do with a drone. Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. Yes, certainly.